Hello, everyone. This is the 196th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Irish author Mr. Paul Little discussing his book Shattered Dreams, Sliding Doors, the Republic of Ireland's 1982 World Cup qualifying campaign. Mr. Little is also the author of In the Shadow of Benbulben, Dixie Dean at Sligo Rovers. Welcome, Mr. Little.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Well, I have in the past written for a number of different outlets. I suppose most recently it would have been for the Irish Daily Star, so I would have written for them part-time on English Premier League football and then for quite a period on European football. But I've also in that time written for other, I suppose, online outlets like Football 365, amongst others. So I've been doing that for a number of years. And then in recent times, actually around about COVID time, I decided that given that I had a bit more time in my hands and there was less football on television, etc., or even being played at all, that I'd have a crack at writing a book. And that was the first book that you mentioned there in the Shadow Benbulben. That was written, it was an idea I'd had a long time before about Dixie Dean, the great Everton striker who played for 6 or 7 months with Sligo Rovers in the League of Ireland towards the end of his career. And so that was a bit of a labour of love and something I was writing for myself to some extent because it was a story that I liked, and I was delighted when a publisher, Pitch Publishing, picked that up. And then subsequently, I decided that I'd have just to prove that it wasn't a fluke that I got one book published that I'd have a go at another. And the Shattered Dream Sliding Doors was that book. And essentially, as an Irish football fan of long standing and having lived through that particular campaign, it was probably the first campaign that I remember. That was what I decided I'd try and write on and see whether I could bring that to life in some way. And it's a famous campaign, perhaps in Irish football, because of how it turned out in the end, I guess. And as I say, the Shattered Dreams side of that might give some idea how that went.
So, and as you said, because you actually lived through it, was that the inspiration, the trigger to write about this topic?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. An element of it was, I suppose, overall and in the round here in Ireland, like I suppose football is such an international sport that when you go into bookshops in Ireland, the bookshelves tend to be dominated by maybe football from other parts of the world in many ways. And when there are books written about Irish football, they tend to be biographies or autobiographies, etc. So I've kind of wanted to add some of our own folklore to those bookshelves and some of those stories. And that particular campaign has a resonance for me. A big part of it is actually the fact that I was in school with then Ireland manager's son Owen Hand, but that was in the couple of campaigns that followed that World Cup qualifying campaign. And it at the time as a child, I was what 10 or 11 years old. I was kind of amazed to be in school with the Ireland manager's son. And then I was saddened at the time because those campaigns didn't go so well that he got actually quite harsh treatment from other people in school and even from teachers in school over how things were going, and his father did too. So that was kind of part of the story in a way and helped kind of inspire it. But that particular campaign for the 82 World Cup, I think if you talk to people of my generation in Ireland, and anytime I've mentioned to anybody, immediately people talk about Brussels in particular and the match away against Belgium and Frank Stapleton's goal that was disallowed. And I think, I suppose that they would talk about just how cruel that campaign was because we weren't expected to really compete in the group, and we ended up coming incredibly close to qualifying for our first international tournament. And up to that point, we hadn't, and we didn't actually qualify until 1988. The sliding doors element of the book comes partly from that. In qualifying for 1988, Jack Charlton was manager, and he got a little bit of luck along the way, I suppose, put it that way. We had long been used in Ireland to hoping that other teams would get a result that would help us along the way. And Jack Charlton had finished that campaign, and we needed Scotland, who were already out, to win in Bulgaria for us to qualify. And amazingly, they did. And that effectively launched, I suppose, Charlton's era in many ways, because had that sliding doors moment not happened, had Gary Mackay not scored for Scotland, then Jack Charlton may never have lasted actually as the Ireland manager. And in the end, he took us to two World Cups and a European Championship. So Owen Hand as the Ireland manager back in 81, 82, he just didn't get that little slice of luck that really could have changed things and maybe changed his life and changed Irish football.
What was the research process like and the duration to write this book? And if you managed to interview any protagonists?
In terms of the length, So I'm thinking now that it's just gone on the shelves back in June, and I would have started thinking about the idea probably 3 years before. So because it's not my full-time work, it was something that I had to research, I suppose, after work and at night time, and then write in that period as well. So I'd usually be writing it a few nights a week or more across the winter of the last 2 or 3 years. So that was part of it, and a lot of that was around researching the newspapers at the time, the Irish newspapers. So a lot of that came from the fact when I did the Dixie Dean book, one of the things I really enjoyed is that getting access to newspaper archives and reading the match reports from 1939 when he played, was really, really interesting to me. And even just seeing what was, when you're looking at a page to see what else was happening in the world at the time, that kind of informed the process then for the second book. And so again, it was all based on, as I say, the newspaper reporting. And then also I was lucky enough to be able to get access to seeing more or less all of the qualifying matches. Again, I hadn't seen them since I was a child. I'd seen highlights, but I was able to watch the full games again, which was very interesting to do, bar the two games against Cyprus as it happened. But yeah, so that was the kind of the process to it, I suppose, and that was a large part of it. In terms of talking to any of the protagonists, I'd actually got back in touch with Gary Hand, who was Owen Hand's son, through LinkedIn, and he put me in touch with his father, who now lives down in rural Ireland, and he's just touching 80 now. And I talked to Owen for about, I had several interviews with him in relation to the book. But with him, what I wanted to do, because the story, certainly in Ireland, is well known, I guess, about that qualifying campaign. Again, certainly amongst people of a certain age, and then even then, I suppose, is in part of our folklore in football. But I didn't want to talk to Owen about that as such because he has covered that ground, I suppose, many times before, and even in his own book. And when I talked to him, I really wanted to talk about, which is the kind of the last chapter of the book, about what might have happened had we qualified. Just to change the angle on it a little bit, I guess, and because also that 82 World Cup for me was the first World Cup I saw in full, and that's the one that's always stuck with me, as perhaps I still don't think any World Cup has come close to matching it for
Same
drama and
here.
for
That was my
stories.
first as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
was. I mean, and I remember parts of the 78 World Cup. I remember parts of the European Championships in 1980, but the 1982 World Cup was the one that I got to see, I suppose, from start to finish.
Like you said, you make references to many newspaper reports. You really get into the weeds as far as match by match, the injuries, withdrawals, and things like that. There are many references to journalists such as Con Houlihan and Peter Byrne. So you really get an idea of what the I guess the talking points were at that point in time. So let's discuss the format of your book, which is part autobiographical, as you reference yourself and your life at home with world and political events in the background as well. How did you decide on such a format?
Well, I didn't want to write the book just in a kind of linear fashion as such, in kind of classic fashion of game to game with nothing in between. So I wanted to give it some kind of context, I guess, even to compare it against modern Ireland, if you like, in many ways, and just what we saw when we were growing up and how the world was in that time. Part of it also was that as a child, my mother used to get myself and my siblings that when we did come home from school, we had to read a newspaper, underline or circle in red words we didn't understand, and that she'd attempt to explain them to us. So that was kind of something that we did. Now, obviously, in the book, it's that's a part of it, but it was a way to try and get across on match days in the group what was happening in the world around us as well at that same time, and as a 10-year-old, how it looked, I guess. So that was kind of part of it, to try and make it slightly different, as I say. And then another element was, again, I didn't initially I'd started out writing it as you would almost in traditional fashion, but then I thought that it would be probably more interesting to write it as if in real time, so that from game to game with no hindsight involved, that we were really just going from paper to paper, from report to report in the build up to matches, the matches themselves, which I was able to view and write them and try and report on them, or write on them as if they're happening now, and then the post match reports from the papers as well from the days after. So that was the process, to try and give it a little bit more, I suppose, a bit of a rhythm, a bit more life maybe, and not to be commenting on, I suppose, the events with maybe 40 years of hindsight. It was more about trying to bring those events at the time to life.
And you even describe the television programs of the day and
Yeah.
what you were watching at night and things like that. So it's very nostalgic in that end, and I'm
Yeah.
sure people of that generation will resonate with what you were watching, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very different world. I think that's what I'm trying to portray as well. And even, in terms of just how football, how we consume it today compared to back then. I mean, back then, the only matches that were shown live on television would have been, and certainly in Ireland anyway, and if only if you were living on effectively on the east coast of Ireland and you could pick up the signal from Britain, you'd get to see the English FA Cup final. You would see maybe some England matches. You would see Ireland's qualifying matches for various competitions. And you'd see the European Cup final or UEFA Cup final, things like that. But you wouldn't see anything else apart from in
Yeah,
highlights
and I
from.
was surprised to learn when you said like not every match was televised.
No, certainly not every match is televised, and it wasn't even certainly in the Irish
I mean, as
campaign.
far as the national team, like not every
Yeah,
match was televised. Yeah.
well, I mean, in the group, in truth, the away game in Cyprus, I guess it was probably more of a technical issue in terms of dealing with Cyprus at the time, who were even, I suppose, a poorer country than Ireland even at that period. But there was no live broadcast of that match. In fact, there's no highlights of that match. There was only radio commentary. The other home matches for Ireland were all broadcast live apart from the home game against Cyprus. And that came down to the Football Association of Ireland being afraid that they wouldn't get a crowd at the match if they were able showing the game live. Now, part of an issue with that is that back then in Ireland, floodlights at stadiums were very much a luxury. And in Lansdowne Road, where Ireland played in the main, they did play in Dalymount Park, which did have floodlights, but they had moved to Lansdowne Road for the major matches, and it didn't have floodlights. So therefore, matches ended up being played maybe 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the day in the middle of the week. So that obviously was going to have an impact on crowds. In that particular game, they were just worried because Cyprus mightn't be the same kind of a draw of the Dutch or the Belgians or the French that they mightn't get a crowd in. But all the other games, in fairness, were live, and particularly obviously the ones that were played away from home were live. But yeah, there was very, very little football, and at the major tournaments would be broadcast live as well. But aside from that, it wasn't for another 2 or 3 years that even the English First Division started to be shown live on BBC and ITV in England, and that was a couple of years coming. So yeah, so it was a very different time in terms of what you saw on television and even how matches were covered. And then, as I say, just to give people a picture, and I suppose absolutely a kind of a sentimental and nostalgic view of the kind of programs that we would have been watching, which I suppose you probably watched them yourselves in the Incredible Hulk and Chips and Starsky and Hutch and all these kind of programs that were actually, they were hugely popular at the time as well. So back here, and again, you had only very limited TV channels available as well. So it's a very, very, very different broadcasting world and a very, very different world for a child, I guess, trying to consume sport.
What was the status of Irish football at international level as we come to this new decade and year 1980?
So we had failed to qualify for the European Championships of 1980, which wasn't a surprise because we hadn't qualified for any tournament before that either. So people didn't necessarily get overly upset about that. However, there was a sense that we hadn't performed well. We had England and Northern Ireland in our group, and the Northern Irish finished ahead of us in that group, and we hadn't performed well. And the last game of that qualifying campaign was away to England in Wembley, and the Irish performance was pretty limp and pretty tame, really. And that did, I suppose, raise a little bit of tension, I suppose, back home with the press. But up to that point, under Johnny Giles, who was the manager and famously a player with Leeds, he was the player manager, and we had made progress under Giles, but it wasn't enough. And so we had some fine results in that over those periods. We'd beaten France in Lansdowne Road in a World Cup qualifier. We had, before that, when Giles was still playing at his height, we'd beaten the Soviet Union in Dalymount back in 1973. So we had results and we had ability, but we were never able to put it all together. And so coming into the qualifying campaign for the World Cup of 82, because we were drawn against Belgium, who had been in the European Championship final in 1980, we had the French, who had been impressive in the 78 World Cup, but were still, I suppose, essentially growing. They missed out on goal difference, I think, for the 1980 European Championships, but they were clearly a kind of a coming power in European football. And then the Dutch, who were perhaps their trajectory was maybe downward at that point, but they'd still played in the last two World Cup finals and still had a number of their players from that period available to them. So we weren't expected going into that campaign, despite the fact that we did have a number of fine players ourselves, to really compete, because two teams would qualify, and of the four teams we might consider ourselves, the Cypriots were not considered to be really involved in any kind of a way other than for perhaps for goal difference. We wouldn't have been expected to finish ahead of the Belgians, the French, or the Dutch.
And more importantly, administratively and structurally, the Irish FA, it's fair to say, were still amateurish and lagging behind the rest of the major nations.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to be fair to the FAI, and they've had an awful lot of criticism over the years, and a lot of it is warranted. They were still the Football Association of a very small footballing country. So, and they would have been up against in an Irish environment against popular sports like Gaelic football, which is obviously the national sport, rugby union, which is also a big sport. So it wasn't as straightforward for them necessarily to be able to compete, but there was a sense that those who worked within the FAI at an administrative level and at a senior level were probably more interested in what they could get from it themselves rather than how they could drive the game forward. They didn't really believe perhaps that we could compete. They didn't really push maybe for the resources required to do that. And a lot of the time they seem to see it as a kind of some way to kind of enhance their own lives and their own experiences rather than necessarily football in the country.
What was the backbone of the Irish squad at this point?
So going into the tournament qualification, I mean, we did have, as I said, as I mentioned there, we had a number of, I suppose, high profile players playing in England in the top division in particular. So Liam Brady and Frank Stapleton, David O'Leary, John Devine were all playing for a strong Arsenal side. Chris Hughton was with Tottenham Hotspur. We had Mark Lawrenson, who was at times with Brighton, but halfway through the campaign, he moved to Liverpool. At the start of the competition, Jerry Daly, who had started at Manchester United, was playing with Derby County and then Coventry City. So we had a number of players who were playing at a high level, and then we were lucky enough, I think, after the second game, where Michael Robinson then joined the ranks, a striker who had been signed for big money to Manchester City at the time, and then had actually moved on to Brighton, where it hadn't initially worked out for him at City, and that he had thought that he might play for England. But he then eventually kind of decided that he would switch to Ireland, and he had moved to Brighton and had a really, really good period at that stage. So he was a great addition as well to the squad. So with Steve Highway of Liverpool was also still involved in the squad also. So Don Givens. So we were pretty strong. As I say, the progress had been made under Johnny Giles, but it had dipped perhaps just in that last qualification tournament. But there was always a sense that we should be able to do better than we had done. But I guess we're talking about going back to the structural elements and how the FAI operated, and how even up before Johnny Giles' time, the manager wasn't necessarily the one who would get to pick the team. Giles pushed back on that and got that kind of power for a manager. Owen Hand then was given that kind of power, but had to effectively fight to retain it. And even just to give you a sense of, if we were playing a home qualifying match, even a big one, they would push back on him looking for, a squad over of 15 or 16 players, which is, that wasn't something that was, you would imagine that would be a straightforward request to even have, 20 players for an international. And nowadays you'd have that and more. But back then it was a matter of cost, and they didn't particularly want to have to pay for extra players to come. And so it was very difficult for the Irish setup that we might have a match on a Wednesday. The players were almost all of them at that period initially anyway were playing in England, and they'd be playing on the weekend on Saturday. They'd start to get together on the Monday. You might get training on the Tuesday. And then when the likes of Brady moved to Juventus, Mick Walsh went to Porto, Don Gibbons was in Switzerland, they mightn't only arrive till the Tuesday or late Monday night. So to try and prepare a squad for an international match was always very difficult. And then if you didn't have numbers in your squad, well, then you only had very small numbers playing five-a-side, in preparation for an international match, perhaps a day before.
So let's get into the campaign. It actually starts at the tail end of the John Giles era in the spring of 1980. The opponents were Cyprus, which, as you mentioned, were the weakest team in the group. Were there just to make up the numbers and be, I guess, cannon fodder for goal difference. And so I imagine victory was the minimum expectation in Giles's send off.
Yeah. Well, just first of all, at that point, nobody was aware that Giles was prepared to leave. So he didn't actually announce his resignation for a couple of weeks afterwards. But it was understood at that time when he did resign that he had more or less decided to leave after the Cyprus game, or even before the Cyprus game. So yes, Cyprus were an amateur side. I think might have had one professional player. They'd never won a qualifying match, so there was no real sense that they should cause a problem to anybody. And as you say, there would be a sense that as the minnows, goal difference might be really, people were looking to improve their confidence and improve their goal difference and beat them. On the day, Ireland very quickly got into a kind of a comfortable 3-1 lead and were very much on top in the game, but then lost control of it a little bit and ended up escaping 3-2 at the end, and quite relieved. But the initial reaction from Giles, at least, was that Ireland hadn't actually won an away competitive fixture for a number of years. So at the very least, he said what was most important on the day, regardless, we should have won by more. We only won by one goal, but the 2 points were critical. And from Giles' perspective, he didn't feel in the group, given its makeup, that it should really matter in terms of goal difference, and that points is probably what was going to be the most important thing in terms of qualification. So I guess Cyprus's story is one where actually their involvement and the amount of goals that they did concede became crucial to the group.
Bearing in mind that just months later, on the same ground, France would win 7-0. Yeah.
Exactly. So that kind of suddenly, I suppose, it put it into some kind of perspective, and so it became an issue. But the Cypriots were unusual, and their results throughout the group were quite unusual because they did travel to Belgium and frighten the Belgians and actually
Oh,
only
right,
lose
right.
3-2 there. They lost 3-0 against the Dutch away, but actually had given them quite a battle. They only lost 1-0 home against the Dutch. So they had some odd results throughout the group, but it just showed I suppose, that ebb and flow. But it was the 7 goals, perhaps, in a way, because ultimately how Ireland failed to qualify and how France did came down to goal difference, and that would have been a big part of it.
In the few months after that, before the fall of 1980, there's a search for a new permanent manager. Can you walk us through this phase leading to the ultimate appointment of Owen Hand?
When Giles resigned, that would have been April 1980. Ireland were set to play 3 friendlies across the summer against the Swiss, against Diego Maradona's Argentina were coming to visit, and then the Czechoslovakia were also to play in Dublin. In the end, that match didn't actually go ahead. But Giles had actually offered to stay in the role until they found a replacement, but the FAI decided that they wanted to have a proper break and go and find a replacement as soon as possible. So initially they placed Alan Kelly, who was Giles's assistant, into the caretaker role, and there was generally a sense that Kelly would be given the job full time. Kelly was still involved in the coaching setup at Preston North End at the time, so but it seemed that they had no issue with him potentially taking on the Irish job, which was a part-time position, and so that he could still maintain his role at Preston. And it looked like after we beat the Swiss 2-0 in a friendly that was what was going to happen. There was expected to be an announcement that Kelly would take the position. But then Preston North End's board seemed to change direction and said that they felt that they were concerned about the amount of workload that there would be with the Irish job. Because one of the reasons why Giles left the position was that he was not only in charge of the senior side, but he also had responsibility for the under 21s and for junior sides, and it was taking up an awful lot of his time. He was also at the time managing Shamrock Rovers, or working with Shamrock Rovers, which he part owned, an Irish club in the League of Ireland also. So there was quite a lot of work in it, and people had been pushing for the job to be a full-time position. But even then, there was a lot of work involved, and Preston essentially put pressure on Kelly to say that he couldn't really take the position. So Kelly, for the Swiss game, had picked Owen Hand as his assistant just for those games. And Owen Hand had been working, he had played for Ireland 5 years before. He'd played in England for Portsmouth. He was back in Ireland, and he had actually he'd become the Irish Soccer Personality of the Year. He'd won or brought Limerick United to a League of Ireland title, another Irish side. They hadn't won a title in 20 years. So he was highly regarded, at least as an up-and-coming coach. Probably a surprise that necessarily he'd get into the Irish setup as he eventually did. He, as I say, was to be Kelly's assistant for the next game. Then in the set of friendlies against Argentina, because Kelly couldn't take the job full time, Owen Hand was asked to be the caretaker manager for that game, which he took on that role. And then subsequently, the FAI advertised the position for the Irish job. Hand applied for it. The likes of Liam Too, who was a former manager, Paddy Mulligan, who'd played for Chelsea, Theo Foley, Paddy Crowder, and the Manchester United great, they'd all applied for the job. In the end, it came down to a committee vote effectively on between Paddy Mulligan and Owen Hand won out and became the manager for the rest of the qualification campaign.
You mentioned earlier that Giles had been a name and had achieved success in the English league. Was there some concern regarding Hand's appointment in the media?
It wasn't immediately apparent, but I would imagine that there would have been, because Giles is a major figure in English football, and I suppose in European football as a player for Leeds. And so I suppose he carried an awful lot of weight, which is one of the reasons why he was able to wrest an element of control off the committee people, I suppose, in the FAI, and be allowed to pick his own teams and his own squads, etc. So Hand, in a way, you might say, might have been something of I suppose, a step down in terms of profile. But he, as I say, he had some success with Limerick United. But I'd say there would have been certain misgivings, I guess, in terms of his capability. However, there was a sense that the Irish team under him had performed very well against Argentina in the friendly that they played, and that gave people a kind of a general sense that he might do well or could do well and had the capability, and that we had players. So yeah, I mean, I think Giles was such a major figure in Irish football. I think for him not to be manager anymore was obviously a blow, and whoever came in was always going to be somewhat in his shadow. So in a way, I suppose Hand was something of a surprise the way things had fallen out because they expected to be Alan Kelly, and that would have suited the FAI as well because there would have been an element of continuity between Giles and Kelly having worked together if Kelly had taken the position. So I suppose it was a bit of a leap into the unknown to some extent.
Well, Owen Hand's first major test was against the Dutch in September 1980. And you mentioned this is a Dutch team that's kind of fading from the glory days of Cruyff, Niskens, etc. You still have some familiar names, Ernie Brands, the Van der Kerkhoff twins, and of course Ipswich's duo Tyson and Muren. But all in all, there is an indication that this is not the same team as before. But nevertheless, it's still the Dutch. They still carry that aura. For this match, after falling behind through a Simon Tahamata goal, the Irish come back. Jerry Daly ties the match with 10, 12 minutes remaining. And with 5 minutes left, Liam Brady lobs a free kick into the box, and Mark Lawrenson heads in the winner. Owen Hand and the Irish pass their first test against one of the major rivals in the group. 2 matches, 2 wins so far.
Yeah, so that was a massive win because as much down to the nature of how the game was turned around and for two late goals, because a lot of people had actually left the stadium before the winning goal was scored. The Dutch, as you say, weren't the Dutch of 74 and 78, although certain players were still involved, but the manager had wanted essentially, perhaps he maybe acted too quickly, but he wanted to overhaul the squad and did so for that match. The Dutch hadn't performed well in the 1980 European Championships, and there was a sense that they had kind of maybe the legs had gone to some extent. So he had brought in a younger players, but as you say, that team still involved Arnold Muir and Franz Tyson, for example. They were still a powerhouse of European football in terms of a production line of players, etc. Ireland might have caught them maybe perhaps at the right time in a transition, but nevertheless, having gone down 1-0 in the game, there was a sense that maybe it would be very difficult for us to turn that around. But the nature in which they played, and I think that was one of the things that maybe captured people's imagination. Giles's football had been tended to be a bit more conservative, and Hand had said that when he came in that he was going to try and I suppose all managers say it, but he was going to try and play more expansive or more attacking football. And in that game, I suppose they had to attack having gone 1-0 down and coming up with two late goals certainly kind of, I suppose, as I capture people's imagination to go and beat the Dutch. They were still, as I say, a power in European football. And it was interesting because the crowd had been maybe 25 to 30,000. It was a large crowd, but as we were to see throughout the rest of the campaign, obviously interest and as hopes grew and interest grew, those crowds grew as well. But to beat the Dutch was a massive, massive thing for Ireland for sure.
The next qualifier is against Belgium. And in contrast to the Dutch, the Belgians are a rising power in Europe. And they just finished runners up in the finals of the 1980 Euros. For this match at home, the Irish fall behind in the 13th minute through an Albert Cluten's goal. But just before halftime, Grealish beats the offside trap of the Belgians, which was their main weapon,
Yeah, there
and
was no mean
ties the
feat to
match.
beat their to beat
Yeah,
their offside trap. Yeah,
yeah. And
absolutely.
another thing, reading your book, I was amazed that they cut them offside 14 times. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I remember that was one of the things I remember even as a child watching the 1980 European Championships. They weren't, I suppose, the most flamboyant championships and most memorable, but I remember one of the features of the Belgians, even as a child, and my discussing with my brothers at the time, that they just their offside trap seemed to catch so many people offside so often. It was incredibly well drilled, and they were very well drilled as a team. And so, yes, they could put a stranglehold on a match. They could clamp down on teams' attacking intent. And at Lansdowne Road, in many ways, it was a disappointment to drop a point. And this isn't the days when there was 2 points for a
No.
win and 1 point for a draw. But to come back and actually get a goal against them, and then again we were pushing in the second half for a winner, which again I suppose it was certainly better than losing, and you could have lost to the Belgians quite easily, and they really were one of the stronger sides in Europe at the time. So coming away a point was disappointing because there was a sense that you would have to at least win all your home games if you could,
Right.
and then
So,
pick up what you could away from home.
in retrospect, was not getting a win at home, was that seen as a lifeline that was lost?
Well, it certainly had an impact later in the group, as the return fixture in Brussels would prove, and ultimately in how the group turned out. At the time, and looking at the match reports, there was an element of regret that the second half efforts of the Irish team didn't yield a second goal. But I think, again, there was a sense that we were playing against one of the stronger teams in Europe, and that to come away with a point and the manner in which we recovered in the game, I suppose, gave again a lot of cause for optimism. And there was plenty of games to play in the group as well, and opportunities perhaps to pick up points. So there wasn't a sense that all was lost, and I think that was initially viewed as a point gained.
A running theme, especially in the lead up in the next match against France, was the difficulty in obtaining releases for international players. Was this in a way a reflection of the FAI's disorganization not to have gotten ahead of such a problem?
But this is a slightly peculiar situation, and I suppose it showed again the difference in football back in the 1980s to now. And also, I suppose it actually showed that the FAI did resort to UEFA rules to try and get the players released, which nobody had ever used before or had to use before, perhaps. But essentially, the story of it was that Ireland were to play France on a Tuesday night in October, which was unusual in itself because most games tended to be on Wednesday nights. So we were away in Paris on the Tuesday. And that unfortunately, Arsenal and Spurs were to meet in a League Cup game the night before in England. And there was an issue essentially, there was other complicating factors, but it came around the fact of Ireland trying to. Spurs and Arsenal were not averse to those players traveling after the game to go and play in Paris effectively 24 hours later, which today that's kind of almost unheard of to think that players would be asked to do that or consider that they would play a big cup match one night and then go and play for their country the following night. And there was a sense that that was no issue in terms of player welfare or anything else, that they would be free to go. But obviously, from the FAI's perspective and Owen Hand's perspective, that wasn't good enough. He needed his players available to even just to prepare. So if you can imagine that he would have lost John Devine, Chris Hughton, David O'Leary, there were none of those. Frank Stapleton were not going to be available. And then there was also issues over Dave Langan, who was also involved in the League Cup tie the following night on the Wednesday night, Don Givens, Jerry Daly, that there was a big issue of club versus country for the players, because obviously from players' perspective, they want to play for Ireland, but they're being paid by their clubs. They're not being paid by Ireland. So that put there was pressure on them there and difficulty. I suppose a key element to it in the end also was that what tended to happen, and if you're going to be critical of the FAI, was that we would have tried to ensure that when there was international dates set for qualifiers, that if you made sure that you were playing the same night as England or Scotland, then there was no issue of your players being released. England would not have league games that would cause a problem, so your players would be free to you from the weekend beforehand. The fact that this particular game was on an official international night, England wouldn't have played on a Tuesday night, and they were playing that week. So the FAI were probably mistaken in allowing that fixture or agreeing to that date in the first place. And so that did cause a problem to obviously On Hand and the FAI and the players. At the same time, the FAI, to their credit, did invoke a UEFA rule, which essentially English clubs, well, it's not that they weren't aware of it. They did. I don't think they felt that it was going to be applicable to them. But after a UEFA ruling, quite close to the game itself, maybe less than a week before, the players were released, and that the English clubs were required to release those players for the match. So that was a victory for the FAI, and it changed a lot in European football because it allowed particularly smaller associations to put pressure and get players released for matches. And so I suppose they deserve credit from that perspective. They probably, and even came under criticism from some of their own players for agreeing to the match on a night that wouldn't be a match night where England would normally play. And had they, as I say, agreed to play or arranged that match for a Wednesday night when England were playing a qualifier, well, then there wouldn't have been an issue in the first place.
As far as the match itself, just like in 1976, France would win 2-0. This is the match where Michael Robinson makes his international debut. And in this match, there's a controversial event in the 57th minute when Robinson, the debutant, seemed to have scored the appeared to be a valid goal, but then it was annulled by the referee because I think he stated that he had seen Stapleton make a handball in the lead up or something like that. And at this point, the French were leading 1-0 through a Michel Platini goal. And if the match was tied, well, who knows what would have happened.
I mean, I suppose in the group itself, there were two matches where we had critical goals disallowed. This was the first of them, and perhaps it's maybe not as famous and sticking in people's psyche so much, partly because for the first half hour of the game, the French were absolutely superb and Ireland were hanging on for dear life and were 1-0 down. But then around about the half hour mark, things started to turn. The Irish had stayed in the game. They came back really, really strongly. They played some very impressive football under difficult circumstances. And we're on top for the last 15 minutes of the first half, and then we're on top for the first 15 or 20 of the second half. And in that period, as you say, Michael Robinson had a goal disallowed. I think there was, again, this is the issue. There was never any real clarity as to why the goal was disallowed. There was some suggestion rather than Stapleton, I think it was Kevin Moran, that he went up for a challenge and there was some suggestion afterwards that it might have been handball, or else maybe it was too robust a challenge. But in 1980s football, say robust challenges are quite different to what would be acceptable today. But there's nothing obvious, really obvious, as to say why it was disallowed, and there was no explanation given. The ball dropped to Robinson. Robinson finished. It looked like Ireland 1-1 on top. Anything could have happened. But I think then from that period on again, I think obviously it was a blow to the Irish team, and they had suffered similarly in the past in Paris with a goal disallowed in the previous, I think it was for the qualification for the 78 World Cup. They'd had a goal disallowed in Sofia, John Giles himself. Again, goals that were where there was no clear reason for it. And so here was another, and it seemed to deflate the Irish team to some extent. They still battled on in the game, but the French came strong again and scored a second goal later on in the game. And I think the reason perhaps that people don't maybe feel as harshly done by in that game is because the French, say, for apart from that period where the Irish dominated, the French were kind of scintillating, and perhaps even if we had got back to 1-1, you could argue that the French were probably the better side. I think when we get onto the Belgium game where Frank Stapleton's goal was disallowed, there was a sense that Ireland were the better team or were very comfortable in that match, and so it felt a lot crueler as things turned out in that particular game.
And the Irish would close out the calendar year 1980 with a comfortable win at home against Cyprus 6-0. Obviously, just a couple of months before they'd seen France win 7-0. So Ireland were desperate to score as many goals as possible. Jerry Daly scoring twice, once on a penalty kick. Grealish, Michael Robinson in his second cap scored his first goal, and Stapleton and Chris Hughton rounded out the scoring. Not much surprise there.
No, I
They had
think, well,
to.
it was Ireland's biggest win in a qualifier, so that was, I suppose, it was a notable occasion. And Robinson's first goal, and I think that was something worth noting in the campaign, is that Robinson had come in against the French and played against Cyprus, and he'd added pace to the Irish attack. I think that was what was key. So Frank Stapleton was a great centre forward, but not the quickest. Don Givens, who was our record scorer, was fading at that point. So Robinson gave real life to the campaign and real power to the side, and that helped us from that point onwards for sure.
We come to the that fateful match against Belgium on spring of 1981, on March 25th at Brussels at Heysel. This is like the key match in these qualifiers that would have ramifications for the rest of the campaign. So, as far as the match itself, Ireland were battling it out with Belgium. Just before halftime, there's that incident where Brady takes a free kick and he found Stapleton in a box who scored. During the play, it seemed like the referee backed into a Belgian player that was on the ground and fell and somehow disallowed the goal, even though there didn't seem to be anything inappropriate with the goal itself. It was unclear why the referee had disallowed this goal. That's the first incident. Then we come near the end of the match. In the 87th minute, Eric Gerrits, the Belgian defender, he clearly took a dive to win a free kick. In the ensuing free kick, Rene van der Eycken attempt, it struck the bar and it went up. As it was coming down, Jan Kulemans was the first one there and he headed in the rebound and scored Belgium's winner. At the end of the match, obviously, Owen Hand and the rest of the Irish squad, I imagine, felt a sense of injustice. And of course, Owen Hand approached the referee and had a few words.
As you said, that's the tale of the match, really, in many ways. That the goal that was disallowed, it's just, I mean, as I say, that is an infamous goal, and the referee Raul Nazare is a name that's well remembered in Ireland. I mean, there was suggestions, I suppose, and Owen Hand feels very strongly that there was some element of cheating involved or corruption. Nothing's ever been proven that I've heard of, but there was at least incompetence, I think, involved is probably a fair way to describe it. Because, as you say, with the free kick that was taken, Brady took it quite quickly, but the referee had turned his back on Brady. So Brady's on essentially on the right hand side of the penalty area, just out of it, and he's clipping it into Stapleton. But the referee had blown his whistle and had turned his back on the play. And then because the ball came in very quickly and Stapleton tucked it away into the goal, when the referee turned around, as you say, he may well have touched off one of the Belgian players, but it's not clear that that had any effect on the goal. In fact, it didn't really. But I think when he turned, he saw a Belgian player on the ground. He saw the ball in the back of the net, and I don't think he knew what had happened. That's my view of it, is that he didn't know what had happened, if we're being charitable. He looked across at his linesman, who had made no movement to suggest there was a problem. And he stared at the linesman, and then 2 or 3 seconds later, the linesman put his flag up, and the goal was then disallowed. But again, it wasn't clear why, and no explanation was given as to why. And again, it was just another game in which Ireland seemed to have been, I suppose, robbed of what appeared to be a goal, and a good goal. As you say, the second half, Ireland were still defending very comfortably and breaking and counter-attacking very well and causing the Belgians trouble. Those last few minutes, Eric Gerrits, as you say, diving to try and win a penalty, gets a free kick. The goal itself then was, I remember as a child watching it, helpless as the ball hit the crossbar and flew into the air, and then the Irish players desperately trying to defend it. But Jan Koolmans was a giant of a man and a very powerful player, and he got to it first and put it away. And my abiding memory was a picture of the Irish bench, and to a man, they all had their heads in their hands. And it was a horrible night. There was a huge thunderstorm, torrential rain. Everything about it was dreadful from an Irish perspective. After the game, Owen Hand claimed that he went up to the referee and called him a cheat, and claimed that nothing ever happened after that. So that made him feel that maybe he was in the right in some way to make that claim. Mick Walsh, who was playing for Porto in Portugal at the time, Liam Brady asked him for some Portuguese words to say to the referee as well, which he did. So I think, I mean, it was really, really cruel. And just a part in the book later on where an Irish journalist 20 years later went to talk to Raúl Nazário, the referee, to ask him why he disallowed the goal. So that just gives you some sense of the extent to which that goal in particular has a kind of was a dagger to Irish hearts, and that feeling lasted a very, very long time. And he tracked down Mr. Nazário to Portugal. He brought with him a video of the game. He asked him again why he disallowed the goal. Without showing the video, he came up with a number of different reasons, again, none of which really stack up. And when you watch the video, again, he seemed himself a little bit at a loss as to explain why the goal was disallowed. So, yeah, it was particularly cruel. And I suppose in terms of the group itself, what was crucial, as you say, is that having dropped a point at home to Belgium, it was really important that we picked up something perhaps in Brussels in that game. And had we gotten a draw there, again, as the group turned out, we would have travelled to the World Cup instead of Belgium.
The next qualifier is almost 6 months away in the following season in September of 1981. Do you think in those months was the mood somewhat negative because of this previous loss and the injustice, or there was still a feeling that they can still get something from this group?
Yeah, well, I mean, we knew we had to beat, if we were going to get anything from the group, we had to beat. We thought we had to beat, or at least not lose against the Dutch or the French in the next few games. Two wins still gave us a chance, but they were going to be difficult because the Dutch had started to improve in the group and had actually moved themselves into a position where they had a chance to qualify. So the game in Rotterdam against the Dutch became effectively almost a do or die for both teams, and a win for either side was really going to make a big difference. And so I think there was still a sense that we really did feel hard done by events in Brussels. But there was, because again, the manner in which the Irish team had stood toe to toe with the Dutch, the French, and the Belgians at this point, there was still hope that we could pick up points. And also, there was hope that because of the tight nature of the group, that the other teams may take points off each other and give us a chance. So, obviously, the aim was to try and win in Rotterdam and win at home against the French in Lansdowne Road. As it transpired, the Dutch game, we didn't get the win. But again, there was a sense coming after it. It was actually a really brilliant game of football and a brilliant display by the Irish to come back and get a 2-2 draw and play so well. Against, again, a Dutch team, as I say, that had turned around at this stage where they'd brought back in the likes of Ruud Král back into the side. They were much stronger than they had been at the start of the group, as I say. So from an Irish perspective, a number of the reports in the papers put that down as perhaps our finest ever away display in a match up to that point. And I think that was probably a fair comment. And the quality of the football the Irish team played really was very eye-catching. And the performances of the likes of Mark Lawrence in particular in that match, who had moved to Liverpool at that point, he was really, really exceptional in that game. Stapleton, Michael Robinson, Ronnie Whelan, it came on late in the game there as well as a 19-year-old, great Liverpool player in the years to come. I think there was a sense, at least, of huge pride after that game about how we'd gone about that game. And okay, the point wasn't ideal for either side really, but we were still had a chance if we could beat the French, and then we needed the Dutch to get a result in Paris in November of that year. If they
Right.
could get a result there, that would have, well, if the Dutch get a draw, if that game ended up being a draw, then we would have ended up playing in a playoff against the Dutch. And I think we would have, yeah, we would have backed ourselves to have a good chance of getting through at that point. So we were still in the race, we were still in the hunt, but we needed that particular game to end up. If we could beat the French, we needed, a result from some help from the Dutch in Paris. The Dutch game in particular, I think, in terms of quality of football, and it was actually it's a great game to watch. It gave people a lot of pride and a lot of hope. And so in the last game against the French, which was the first game I ever went to see, Lansdowne Road had its biggest ever crowd for an international game. There was no, I think it was a sellout of 53, 54,000 people, and it was sold out long before the game. And I guess, I mean, the French were seen as a quality team, and the likes of Michel Platini was well known. So there was obviously an attraction there, but there was a sense that we were still in the hunt, and hence the stadium was sold out, and there was huge excitement about that particular game.
Yeah, and this match against the Dutch at Rotterdam, that would be Steve Highway's final cap for Ireland. Ireland fell behind 11th minute through France Tyson, but Michael Robinson ties the match. They fall behind again through an Arnold Muir penalty kick, but then Frank Stapleton ties the match. It's strange that normally getting a tie against the Dutch at Rotterdam would be seen as a something to build on, something positive. But in this case, it really didn't help either team. And it was a letdown for both teams in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the shame of it. But as I say, still both teams were still in with a chance to qualify. So whilst it was a disappointing result, there was still always hope that other results might go your way within the group. And so for Ireland, I think, I suppose after that game, there was still a sense that to get to the last game in the qualifiers and still have a chance of qualifying, given that we were up against the teams we were up against, again, that was considered to be quite an achievement, really. And so as I say, there was great excitement over the final game against the French.
And as you said, this game against France on October 14th, 1981, that was your first match as a spectator witnessing Ireland play a match. So can you walk us through that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never been to see Ireland play, and I hadn't even been to a match at that point. So I went, luckily, and it was quite a surprise. My father and my next door neighbour's friend's father came up with tickets for the game, so five of us set off. Now, I was only 10. My older brothers would have been one was a year older, and then there was one who was probably 15 or 16. So he was effectively heading the delegation that were setting off to the match. One of the next door neighbors was a year younger. So in a way, even thinking back on it, because I was actually chatting to one of them recently, that the fact that we were even allowed go was kind of amazing and go on our own. We were driven down by my father down halfway, and then we walked from there to Lansdowne Road. And in those days, I mean, it's known as the Aviva Stadium these days, and it's a very fine modern stadium. But back then, it was largely terraced, I suppose, and standing. So there was the west stand would have been all seated. The east stand down that side of the pitch, only the top tier of it was seated. Below that then was a terrace the whole length of the pitch, and then behind the two goals were terraced as well. So when we arrived, I do remember that we positioned ourselves effectively. The Irish, or there was a goal. We were probably level with the 18-yard box, I think, down at the south terrace end, as it would have been known. And I suppose I was lucky that's where all the Irish goals were scored in the first half. And so I got to see some of that. But just to give you a sense of it, we arrived in, we positioned it, we were there an hour and a half, nearly 2 hours before kickoff. We positioned ourselves where we thought we might see something. I was not big or tall. We stood with a crash barrier in front of us, or a crush barrier. As the crowd started to file in, I could see less and less, unfortunately, of the pitch, till essentially when the game started, I could see a narrow strip that was around about the 18-yard box at that end of the pitch. I could see nearly nothing up the other end. But as I say, I was lucky enough that that's the end at which the Irish team scored three times in the first half. I remember the crush when the first goals were scored, and we realized, or my older brother realized, that it would be better to stand in front of the crush barrier rather than effectively pressed on it because it really was quite the crowd certainly moved around, that was for sure. You may have started in one place and you ended up absolutely in another. So we positioned ourselves slightly better after that. I tried to sit on the barrier, I remember that, and I couldn't. It just didn't feel very safe to do that either. So it really was, yeah, it was quite a remarkable noise. It was an amazing thing to see. You could get a sense of the game without seeing the game. I mean, I've seen the game obviously since, but I couldn't see what was happening most of the time, but I you could feel what was happening. I think that was probably one way to describe it. After the game, I suppose the abiding memory was, as inexperienced children that we were, we decided to leave with the main crowd, and that wasn't very sensible in many ways. And I remember, and I can still feel it now, my feet were off the ground as I left the stadium, and it wasn't out of excitement. It was because I was crushed between so many people, and they were effectively carrying me out through the gate. It was kind of quite. It was not necessarily scary because I'd never experienced it before, but when you consider, I suppose, a number of disasters that have befallen people subsequently in football stadiums, I suppose in a way it was kind of we were kind of lucky in some ways, but with 54,000 people in the stadium and leaving that stadium, and I suppose safety and whatever else being quite different in 1980 as it is now, it really was, yeah, that was something that stuck in my mind. And I'd actually just thinking about it as well, in the reporting by Irish media on the game in Brussels in the Heysel Stadium, and people will remember the dreadful disaster that was to befall that in it was 4 years later, I think, in '85 or whatever, that the Irish journalists were talking about what a great stadium the Heysel Stadium was and what a fantastic stadium it was, and yet it crumbled effectively in the Liverpool Juventus disaster, the European Cup final a few years later. So it's interesting just even to look back and see how even stadia were considered or viewed in those days, and safety for fans, etc., was quite a different thing, really. So you certainly wouldn't find yourself in that situation nowadays, I don't think. But yeah, it was an extraordinary kind of experience and one that stuck with me all the way through. And the fact then that the Irish played brilliantly, particularly in the first half, fought like dogs in the second half to hang on in there. And to come out 3-2 winners was really like a phenomenal result again against the powerful team. And again, it gave us hope into the last game. It meant that the French had to beat the Dutch, and the French still had another game against Cyprus. So were the French to win their two games, they were going to end up on 10 points. We were finishing on 10 points. So we were really hoping that if the Dutch could get a draw, the Dutch could finish on 10 points also if they could at least get a draw in Paris. And so it gave us a little bit of hope that although the two teams, the French and the Dutch, needed to win, just like us in Rotterdam against the Dutch, two teams may want to win and may go hell for leather for a win, but it's not impossible that there might be a draw. And so we still had hope, but there was an awful lot of pride that we had beaten France as we had done on that particular day.
And you witnessed Don Givens playing for the last time for the Republic of Ireland on that day.
Yeah.
And
I'm not sure
yes.
I might have seen any of them at all, though, mind you, but yeah, I was there. Yeah, I was there.
He comes in like in the last few minutes, to be
Yeah,
fair.
I
So
think they were trying to
maybe,
run the clock down. He would have been going
uh,
the other end of the pitch, so I don't think I would have seen him at all. Yeah.
you witnessed Philippe Maud score an own goal for France as early as the third minute, but then
Mm,
the French tied in the ninth minute. But then, like I said, Irish take a 3-1 lead before halftime, before France kind of comes back and score a goal through Platini towards the end. So there's some nail biting in the last few minutes, but Ireland hold on and
yeah.
get an
I think it's one
important win.
thing just to say as well, because I've watched the matches back and actually to see someone like Platini again, it's worth people looking at full games if you can get a chance to look at these players back when they were playing in their heyday. Because when you were watching them then, obviously you could see how great they were. But looking back now, like Patini is such a kind of a languid looking figure. He doesn't look, just to look at him directly, you wouldn't think anything of him. But when you see him play, and particularly throughout that qualifying tournament and in the last game against the Dutch as well for them, like he really was like a magnificent footballer for somebody who didn't really even look like a footballer.
The destiny of the Irish was out of their hands. France would win the final two matches. In fact, in the match against the Dutch, Platini scores one of his very more famous free kicks to give France the win. They would win 2-0. And of course, the last match against Cyprus was always going to be a formality for the French. They would win, and the Irish dream was over. And like at the end, I think Belgium finished with like 1 point ahead of France, the Dutch, and the Irish, all on 10 points, I think.
And so we
And
missed out in the
very
end on
close.
on
Yeah.
goal difference. That was the cruelty of it. And I think what was also doubly cruel from an Irish perspective is that Northern Ireland and England both qualified for that World Cup.
The narrative about the Northern Ireland was that their qualification was so significant because they had access to a smaller player pool than the Republic of Ireland. Was that part of the regret as well?
Not really as such. I think it was more based on the fact that we'd finished on 10 points in a much tougher group, and yet Northern Ireland in an easier group had finished on 9 points and we're
Even
going.
England finishing nine
And
points.
English and the English particularly, because that really gave a sense of our
You know,
achievement.
England had the worst record of any of the qualifiers. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. No,
Yeah,
but
of
that
all the
was
Europeans, yeah.
yeah. So that there was a real sense of it compounded the sense of injustice that how well we'd performed in such a tough group, and yet Northern Ireland were going. I know not to begrudge Northern Ireland or England, it seemed cruel that they would go, but yeah, particularly when they didn't perform as well as we had performed, I guess.
In the book, there's discussion that qualification would have shifted the balance of power of the manager against the FAI higher ups. Can you get more into this and some of their practices that hinder the team's progress?
But I think we touched on this earlier on in the discussion, and again, the FAI were not. I mean, they were the association over the hierarchy over a small football association, really. So in looking back, there's an element that you have to keep that in mind. Ireland was not a powerhouse in European football. It wasn't a rich association. But again, there was just that sense that they didn't really believe that the Irish team, they didn't see what they could be. And that was proven later on, I guess, under Jack Charlton and what subsequently was going to happen and what the potential was. And that they probably didn't recognize that maybe more help to what was actually quite a talented squad could have yielded better results. So this comes down to, I suppose, just examples of how they operated. As I was saying, there would be pressure on managers not to pick large squads because they didn't want to have to pay for them effectively when they were over here in Ireland or going abroad. The players would be in hotels. Owen Hand was telling me that they'd be treated to a room. They famously, when for the qualifiers for I think it was they played away in Moscow. They were to play away in Moscow against the Soviet Union, and the Danish manager at the time, Sepp Piontek, had warned Owen Hand that it would be a very good idea if you're going to play in Moscow to bring your own food and to bring your own chef if possible and prepare your own food. Just there was a suggestion that teams that often played in Moscow ended up perhaps feeling their stomachs weren't quite right when the games came around. So Han took that on board, said it to the FAI. The FAI, he told them that at the time Liverpool, who obviously were playing a lot of European football, had used a chef from a Dublin hotel actually who used to travel with them for their away matches to prepare their food. So Owen Hand has suggested that the FAI bring him along for this trip and their own food along to Moscow, but the FAI didn't want to pay for him to go, didn't see the sense of it, and so Owen Hand, in a bid to embarrass the FAI, suggested that perhaps if they weren't going to bring a chef, that maybe his own wife would come and cook the food. And he was hoping that would embarrass the FAI, but actually they weren't that easily embarrassed, and they thought that was a great idea, and so they brought his wife along instead. But even, I mean, there's other elements too. When he got the job as manager, it was just before the European Championships of 1980, and the Belgians and the Dutch were playing in the tournament, and he suggested that it would be a good idea for him to go over and scout the two teams that were going to be playing in the qualifiers coming up. The FAI were reluctant to let him go, and he pressed and pressed, and eventually they accepted and they said, okay, they'd let him go. And when he arrived in Rome and went to his hotel, he found his hotel, shall we say, was not really one, it was say a hotel that people would use by the hour rather than by the night. So that in itself was a shock, and he ended up staying with some of the Irish media who were in Rome at the time covering the tournament instead. So even down to things like, again, that the Irish players, more or less all of them, played in either England or Scotland. Now some played in Europe at the time. As I say, we saw Brady go to Juventus, Mick Walsh is in Porto, but by and large they would have been week in, week out playing in England. And even suggestion of going over to watch the players over there was met with reluctance by the FAI and wondering why on earth he'd want to do that. So that they either didn't have a sense of it or they didn't want to pay for it, or both. And so down to the extent that Owen Hand himself had to arrange deals with Dublin hotels to move the team out to something that he felt was better than what they were being put in. They were put in the city centre in a pretty poor hotel, and he had to go himself and negotiate with another hotel on the outskirts of the city to get the team set up there. And I suppose tellingly, I think when we go back to the refereeing decisions that Ireland suffered in that period, Owen Hand says that one of the things that struck him at the time was that the FAI treated referees almost as badly as they treated their players, I suppose is how he described it. And so that when referees would come to Dublin, they would be put up in hotels that Owen Hand would just couldn't believe that they would put them there. They certainly weren't quality hotels. But he was saying at the time, other associations, when they had a match and a big match, the referee would be very well looked after, not trying to curry favor, although it may well influence the referee's decisioning or how they were treated. But he said it felt it gave perhaps referees a sense that the Irish just weren't serious. And so that if it came down to a game, and all these famous games, Paris twice, Sofia, Brussels, where we had goals disallowed, they were all away games. And perhaps there was a sense with a big crowd, a home crowd roaring on a side, that it was just easier to decide against Ireland in those situations because the Irish weren't a serious football nation in a lot of people's views at the time. And the FAI perhaps were guilty in that regard.
In the end, this was a very competitive group where any combination of two of the four teams could have just as well qualified. So, was there a consolation in that regard, or was all the narrative about the injustice at Brussels?
Well, I mean, there was clearly discussed at what had happened in terms of injustice, but you got to remember we've never qualified for anything before, so there was, in a way, there was a kind of an acceptance that this is what happens, or this is what might happen to a smaller country, and in a way that tempered disappointment because the World Cup was coming up, and in Ireland everybody loved the World Cup, and so we were all going to enjoy the World Cup regardless. It would have been very nice for Ireland to be there, but I remember as a child that I didn't really think about the fact that we weren't there when the World Cup was on. But yeah, I mean, I think I suppose there would have been a sense though that progress had been made, and that come the next qualifiers we could be more competitive perhaps, and that we'd come so close that surely qualification couldn't be that far away. So that was a consolation, I think, to people. But as it turned out and transpired in the next two qualifying campaigns for the Euros and for the World Cup in '86, that actually just things unraveled more so than improved.
Exactly. It seemed like Ireland were unable to build up on these qualifiers, and with still Owen Hand in charge, and objectively they performed less impressively, let's just say, in the 1984 Euro qualifiers and then the 1986 World Cup qualifiers. So why do you think the team and Owen Hand failed to build up on that near success with more or less the same crop of players?
Yeah, well, his own opinion was that for the '84 European Championships, that it actually the failure to qualify for the World Cup and the manner in which we missed out had a much deeper impact on the players psychologically than he that people maybe realized, and that it was very hard to get them motivated for '84 for those qualifiers, but also that there was a sense amongst the players that even if they did perform well, even if they did play as well as they possibly could, that something would happen again that would essentially see them not go. Now, something to remember also, and that is that in the next set of qualifiers for the European Championships, only one team would qualify out of a group because only 8 teams in those days played in the European Championships, and Ireland were pitted against Spain and the Dutch again. And so to finish top in that group was always going to be difficult again, and particularly the Spanish, who had a disappointing '82 World Cup. But as you see, they won that group and very close, very tight with the Dutch again. The Dutch had improved again, and I suppose turning things around to some extent. They had a new crop of players starting to come through and famous players, as we'd see later on. But that wasn't going to be an easy group to qualify from. So perhaps if we weren't in the right frame of mind, and maybe that's how it was, and the Spanish, who actually went on then to reach the European Championships finals in '84, that was a difficult group to come through. I think probably more disappointing was the nature and the manner in which we more or less fell apart for the '86 qualifiers. And in that group, we had the Danes, who had reached the semi-finals of the '84 European Championships and actually were really one of the most exciting teams in Europe at the time of becoming that, and the Soviet Union in that group as well. So that, again, that was another tough group. So there was no sense that we were definitely guaranteed to qualify from any group. We weren't still getting any easy draws, but I think I'd say players at the point of '86 and that qualifying campaign had perhaps lost faith in Hand himself, perhaps, and in I guess that was probably at the heart of it in many ways. And they actually started very well in that qualifying campaign. They beat the Soviet Union in Dublin with a great Mick Walsh goal. But from there, things never really took off in that group, and we were nowhere near qualification. And in fact, the last game in that qualifiers, I think we were comfortably beaten by the Danes at home. I think it was 4-1 on the day, and that
4-1,
was the
yeah.
end. Yeah, it was the end of Owen Hand's time.
Do you think your contemporaries still look at this campaign and see an opportunity lost? And have you noticed any feedback from younger fans, or this is not part of their consciousness at all?
Yeah, well, I don't think it is necessarily part of their consciousness because they may have heard of it, and my own sons and children will have heard me talk about it. But I would imagine that it's way too far beyond, I suppose, a lot of young people, obviously even before their time, I guess. But it is, as I say, if you talk, and I have to contemporaries, and as soon as I mention what I've written or what the book is about, almost to a man and a woman, they'll, as I say, they'll talk about Brussels, they'll talk about the referees, they'll talk about the injustice of that campaign, and people remember it very, very well. I suppose it hurt people deeply at the time. For younger Irish fans, Thierry Henry's handball, that playoff in Paris, is really what sticks in most people's minds. And again, that really, I suppose we all feel that. I've lived through both, so I know what that's
Mhm.
like. But I think I'd say it's hard for them to get a sense of how difficult the 1981 one was, I suppose. But they've had their own troubles with Thierry Henry. But such are the troubles of the Irish football team at the moment, and how we lack competitiveness. I think we'd almost be delighted to get back in a situation where we might be in a playoff and lose in that situation, lose cruelly, because we're not even close at the moment. We're not competitive, unfortunately.
In closing, what is the legacy of this World Cup qualifying campaign in Irish football history as well as culture? Is this qualification process regarded as a reference point in any way?
Well, I think it's definitely one that, let's say, that's remembered. And I would say, from my own perspective, when I was reflecting on it afterwards, and what I wanted the book to be in a way was a celebration of how that team had pushed and moved the dial effectively towards qualification. As I say, we'd never really come close before. We'd never competed in such a tough group as well as we'd competed. So I think that did give us a sense of what was possible. Even though we knew we had good players, as I said, the results never really came. But this is the first time where we actually got perhaps a string of good results against very strong teams. As I say, and next few qualification campaigns did not go well for us. However, it was kind of nice to see that when Jack Charlton got that slice of luck that Owen Hand didn't get in that his own sliding door moment, if you like, that a number of the players from the Hand era did make it to the European Championships in 1988 and to the World Cup in 1990. So I suppose it carried across, even though there was a bit of a gap where things didn't work out, that there was still an experience there that was carried across that helped us, and I suppose kept interest in the game as well, that we had good players still across that period that kept us competitive to some extent. And when Jack Charlton took over, there was a lot of experienced, good players available to him to help him at that period. So yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely, and as you see, there's a lot of resonance in Ireland in relation to that particular campaign. But as I say again, the focus of the book in some ways, or the angle, was that had the referee Raul Nazare back in Brussels made a different decision, then Owen Hand's career could have been different. The Irish setup, it might have been different, because if we had qualified for that World Cup, well, then we would have been psychologically perhaps a stronger team, and a team that were more attractive for teams, maybe, or for people to come and join. And when new players came in, we were dealing with players who had tournament experience now, who had belief that they could qualify. Whereas what happened afterwards, that belief kind of gradually just kind of slipped away. But also for someone like Owen Hand, he would have been the youngest manager ever to qualify a team for a World Cup. Had we qualified in 82, he was only in his mid 30s. And in his career, subsequently, he ended up managing a few League of Ireland teams and then coaching in Saudi Arabia and South Africa. But had he qualified at that point and took Ireland to that World Cup, his profile would have been considerably different. And who knows where that may have taken him, but that was an opportunity that slipped away, through no fault of his own, in terms of 81, 82, I guess. And it could well have changed his life. But he's very philosophical about that. And he does close out the book effectively by saying that perhaps, maybe we could have qualified. Maybe my career could have been different. Maybe I could have gone to big clubs and become rich, but then maybe I might have bought a helicopter, and then maybe I might have crashed the helicopter, and maybe I'd be dead anyway. So he just has taken a view that he did all he could do. He's proud of what he tried to do. And it was very frustrating how things turned out, but he couldn't have done it any different.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to your book, once again, Shattered Dreams, Sliding Doors, the Republic of Ireland's 1982 World Cup qualifying campaign. The link to this book is on the blog and podcast uploads as well. So, Paul, thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me, Shan. That was absolutely delighted to talk to you, and it's great to to go back to those times. And I'm hoping things turn around for Ireland soon and we get a different sliding door moment perhaps coming for us soon.
Yeah. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you.